All right, Mike here once again, bringing to you another interpretative guide on another chapter from the book Language and Neoliberal Governmentality. And today we're going to be looking at a chapter by Nelson Flores called Producing National and Neoliberal Subjects, Bilingual Education and Governmentality in the United States. Okay, so governmentality is a huge analytic. So I do have a dedicated governmentality lecture that you can also watch, located elsewhere in my channel. In this video, though, we're going to concentrate on the phrase grid of intelligibility. And this is while we talk about California's Proposition 227 and Proposition 58, both laws dealing with bilingual education in the state of California. Okay, so I decided to really focus on this grid of intelligibility phrase. Because I think if you really got this down, everything else will make a lot more sense. And Flores uses this phrase 18 times. 18 times. So we're going to concentrate on that. Now, in the word intelligible, we got the word legible. All right, to recognize something as relevant, it must be legible. We got to be able to read it, right? Things are not legible because they exist on some universal plane of legibility, existing outside of time and history. No. Things must be made intelligible because not everything can be perceived at all times. So we got to produce the intel to interpret whatever thing or phenomenon that we're talking about. So that word intel, intelligibility, intel. Think of gathering intelligence, right? So here we're kind of creeping up to the Foucauldian word knowledge, to know things. Knowing things is what makes it possible to govern. It makes governability possible. So the more we know, the better institutions can govern. And when institutions produce intel, they also produce a perspective on reality, a specific form of legibility. And that will be backed by particular institutions that will do what it takes to protect their interests, to protect their version of reality as seen through a grid of intel, through a grid of legibility. Yes, through a grid of intelligibility, which seems to put things in order, right? It helps us make sense of the world and frame situations. For example, within a particular grid of intelligibility, we recognize a problem. We frame something as a problem because remember, that is also a frame. And then we're guided to think a certain way, to think of solutions. Just the way we are guided in certain ways to see certain social phenomena as problems. So not everything is a problem at all moments in time, just like solutions of the same problem are not always the best solutions for all time either. However, we must remember that there will be institutions that have an interest in solving problems and defining problems in a certain way to their own benefit. Now, these matters are handled through forms of governance, governmentality. So in California, bilingual education was framed as a problem, and two kinds of solutions emerged. One under a nation-state colonial governmentality, and another kind of solution under a neoliberal governmentality. So remember, these are ways to govern that emerge from and with and within a grid of intelligibility, with the power to define the problems and to define potential solutions. So Proposition 227, which came out in 1998, promoted monolingualism in the interest of nation states, or the nation state, in order to produce governable citizens. And because we think of language as tied to nationality, meaning on that grid of intelligibility, reality is defined this way or through this particular perspective, it in turn becomes clear to some that the solution is banning bilingual education. So somehow this will make the brown students better citizens by not providing bilingual education. I mean, look at this picture. I thought this was fake, but no, it's a real picture. So look at this generous white man, white Republican, helping the brown children. What a good job. So almost 2 decades later, we get Proposition 58 in 2006, which promoted bilingualism as good for a global economy. So specifically, language as a skill is believed to foster economic growth. So here we have an economic logic involved in the solution, which conceptualizes language as a potential asset in a neoliberal world or in a global economy. So again, notice the solution has changed because the problem is reframed in a new grid of intelligibility. So the problem and the solution becomes legible in a different way. And apparently with this solution, we have more happy brown children. Now, both of the solutions, according to Flores, promote white supremacy. But how, you say? That's the tricky part. So let's go back to thinking about the grid of intelligibility, or let's think about the grid. And let's think of that grid through a metaphor, like this one. So you've all seen these kinds of puzzles, right? Where you look for the words and you circle them. So let's think of this as a grid of intelligibility. The alphabet has an entire history or intel or knowledge that makes certain combinations of letters legible as words. Now, over time, very slowly, maybe the letters shift around a little bit with institutions coming in and out of existence. But these institutions, they back certain words as words because it is in their best interest to do so. So let's say there's this white supremacist institution that exists with a set of interests that protect the word red. But there are also counter institutions saying, no, your red is backward. We see this as red, the other way. Now, over time, as grids shift, it becomes necessary to half-heartedly recognize oppositional institutions, specifically in this case. So what the white supremacist institution says, oh, we recognize your backward red so long as it is on our terms. So we recognize the word redder. That way, we have an interest in your backward red. So this is particularly dangerous because it spells redder from both perspectives. From left to right, right to left, right? So it becomes difficult to remember that ultimately the more powerful institution gets to say, you all are reading that backwards. Obviously, the directions of the letters say that we're still correct. Our white supremacist institution is still correct. Now, so while perhaps the letters might shift around a little bit from one time to the next, this particular powerful institution has adapted with the grid to make more things legible in a certain way that still protects itself as an institution. Now, this is mainly to say that grids overlap. They never completely go out of existence, including the two forms of governmentality that Flores names nation-state colonial governmentality and neoliberal governmentality. So, real quick, this is not a different governmentality from Foucault's version. It's a more specific governmentality. This highlights that the way that we produced intel, that the way we produced legible types of people, or intelligibility, was through nation-state formations and colonialism. So Flores is saying nation-state and the nation-state formulations and colonialism produced a perspective on reality that produced legitimate types of people that remains relevant today. But there is also an emerging grid of intel and legibility that considers how types of people come into being with transnational corporations becoming more and more institutionalized. And it is the logic of the market that is becoming more and more disseminated into our everyday language, which makes different aspects of the same thing relevant, but in a different way. It's re-articulated. So we can say that new stuff becomes legible. Yet at times, particular power formations are just re-articulated while preserving their own power. So think of that example of redder. Now, finally, on one last note, and this is specifically on types of people becoming legible, or specifically with the more academic phrase, subject position. So subject positions are legible as legitimate or illegitimate. So grids produce legitimate and illegitimate subject positions that persons can then occupy, or be legible as a type of person that is seen as beneficial to society or not. Now, under a nation-state colonial governmentality, monolingual people were seen as legitimate. So one nation, one language. But even then, if you spoke with an accent or were a person of color, there were plenty of ways to keep you in an illegitimate subject position, meaning governing mechanisms were produced to keep monolingual non-white persons subjugated. So the white supremacist institution shifted its tactics. For example, we're not saying your race is deficient, but, oh, by the way, bilingualism makes you dumb, which was an institutionalized scientific argument backed by science for a really, really, really long time. And we're still dealing with it even today. Now, under neoliberal governmentality, Flores is warning us that we will need to look for the new governing techniques that will keep particular populations subordinated, even if the methods look friendlier. So this paper is about that emerging grid of intelligibility with emerging governing techniques that will more than likely re-articulate racial hierarchies in the interest of white supremacy. Luckily, or whatever, where there is power, there is resistance. But you'll have to read the chapter to see what Flores suggests that we can do. Okay. Well, that's all for today. I hope you walked away with a better idea of what this grid of intelligibility is. And as usual, hit the like button, follow me on Twitter and academia and all that stuff. I am Mike. I will see you around.